Evening, ladies and gentlemen. The year 2020 has been a very difficult year for all of us. And even in the face of all these difficulties, the Indian Society of Anesthesia has managed to run all its programs and schedules and clinical meetings. And we are now on the last clinical meeting of this year 2020. And I welcome you all to this meeting on behalf of the Department of Anesthesia and Indraprastha Apollo Hospital. To make this meeting interesting, we have three presentations and also a quiz, which will be held by Dr. Vikram Mahajan, our quiz master. Without wasting any time, I would like to proceed to the flag hoisting ceremony. Mr. Amia, can you please load the flag hoisting ceremony, please?
Can we all stand for the flag hoist?
So please stand for the ISF flag hoisting.
It's a great honor for me to introduce the Indian Society of Anesthesia members. Mr. Amia, can you please load the introductory slides, please? Dr. Rajiv Gupta is the Governing Council member, North of India, Indian Society of Anesthesia National. Next, please. Dr. Nikki Sabarwal, President, ISA Delhi. Next. Dr. G. Usha, Vice President. Next. Dr. Umesh Deshmukh, Secretary. Next. Dr. Anu Vijayant Goel, Treasurer. Next, please. Dr. Parul Malik is the editor. Next. Dr. Arvind Arya, GC East Zone. Next, please. Dr. Arun Mehra, GC West Zone, ISA, Delhi. Next. Dr. Amit Kohli, GC Central Zone. Next. Dr. Ashish Dang, GC North Zone. Next, please. Dr. Ranju Gandhi, GC South Zone. I would now request Dr. Nikki to give her valuable message.
Thank you, Dr. Murli. A very, very good evening to all of you. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this clinical meeting, which is, like Dr. Murli said, the last of this year, and it's being hosted by Indraprastha Apollo Hospital. I thank Dr. Sanjeev Aneja, Dr. V. Murlidhar, and Team Apollo for organizing today's clinical meeting. Some very interesting case series and studies are being presented, and we are looking forward to hearing them. And we're also looking forward to the quiz that has been organized by Team Apollo. Let me take this opportunity to greet you and wish you all the very best for the season, festive season, and also a very, very happy and healthy New Year 2021. Let us pray that the New Year brings with it happy times and we all see the end of this COVID pandemic. And like Dr. Aneja was saying, we can meet each other like we used to before this pandemic changed everything about how we interact and how we are anesthetizing our patients. You know, interaction has just kind of come to a standstill, physical interaction, that is. So we are really, really hoping that this pandemic will see its end soon and we can come back to our normal social and academic meets. And I once again thank Team Apollo for organizing this, despite everybody being so caught up and so busy with the activities revolving around this pandemic. So thank you very much. Stay safe, stay blessed. Long live ISA, long live ISA Delhi. Jai Hind.
If there are, thank you so much, Dr. Nikki. If there are no more messages, I think we'll move on to the clinical presentations. There are three clinical presentations. The first is a very interesting one, which is already published. It's on robotic thymectomy. The second is by Dr. Ashish Malik. It's a comparison of two variants of epidural plus dural puncture. And the third presenter is Dr. Balaji, and he's going to compare chloroprocaine with bupivacaine for spinal anesthesia. Can we have the first presentation, please?
I hope good evening, everyone, and I hope that everybody is able to see my slides. Okay, so today's first presentation is on the anesthetic management of myasthenia gravis patients undergoing robotic thymectomy. This case series was published in the latest edition of the Brazilian Journal of Anesthesiology. And since robotic thymectomy is a very highly specialized surgery, I would like to start with a small video clip of the robotic thymectomy for orientation of our viewers. So this shows the position of the patient. And this is the robot which is being wheeled in. The docking of the robotic ports. This is the thymus gland inside me. This is the surgeon in his robotic console. So myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disease, and it is characterized by the fatigability and weakness of the skeletal muscles, which improves on rest. The etiology of myasthenia is a decrease in the number of postsynaptic acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction, which in turn causes a decrease in the capacity of the neuromuscular end plate to transmit the nerve signal. Most commonly, the eyelids and the extraocular muscles are involved. Bulbar involvement may be manifested as difficulty in chewing and swallowing. The surgery for thymoma patients is thymectomy, and thymoma is usually present in about 10 to 15% of the patients with myasthenia gravis. Thymectomy is a known modality of treatment of myasthenia, and in conjunction with medical therapy, it has shown to increase the probability of remission and overall symptomatic improvement also. The conventional surgical techniques consisted of sternotomy or thoracotomy, while recently the minimally invasive techniques such as the video-assisted thoracoscopic surgery and robotic-assisted surgeries have come up. Robotic thymectomy offers a much superior approach to VATS. Now, during the thoracoscopic surgery, it is necessary to create a space in the thoracic cavity in order to identify the anatomy and for instrumentation. And providing this surgical access is challenging. Conventionally, it was performed by the use of double lumen tubes or endobronchial blockers to collapse the one lung. In this, it is necessary to insufflate a certain volume of CO2 initially to collapse the lung, and then insufflation is not required. Nowadays, a continuous capnothorax technique has come up in which the single lumen tube with double lung ventilation is seen to provide adequate surgical access. In this technique, the capnothorax is used to cause the initial partial lung collapse, and the capnothorax needs to be maintained throughout the surgery with continuous insufflation. Here, the pressures are usually maintained at slightly higher levels than the conventional method. Robotic thymectomy in itself presents a unique set of challenges, and here we present a case series of 20 cases of robotic thymectomy and its perioperative anesthesia management. The purpose of studying these cases was to see the feasibility of the continuous capnothorax technique with single lumen tube and the various anesthesia considerations. Coming to the preoperative concerns and management, a thorough preoperative assessment was done in coordination with the patient's neurologist. The main focus was on bulbar or respiratory symptoms, along with any prior history of exacerbations or myasthenic crisis, which was noted. The severity of the disease and the current treatment regimens were also reviewed. No sedative premedication was given. In these patients, the surgery should usually be scheduled as early in the day as possible when the patient is strongest. Pyridostigmine and corticosteroids were continued perioperatively, and pyridostigmine was also given on the morning of the surgery. In these patients who are maintained on anticholinesterase, they can be very sensitive to the discontinuation of medication and can develop respiratory or bulbar weaknesses. The intraoperative management consisted of general anesthesia with single lumen endotracheal tube. An induction was done with fentanyl and propofol. Neuromuscular blockade was with small incremental doses of atracurium titrated to effect and guided using a quantitative pain of the pore nerve stimulator. These patients, neuromuscular blockade is required for adequate ventilation, maintenance of normocarbia, and also to avoid any injury due to the movement of the patient. The TOF was monitored throughout the surgery, and 0.05 milligram per kg of atracurium was repeated when TOF was more than 3. CO2 insufflation in the continuous capnothorax technique was to a pressure of about 8 to 10 millimeter of mercury. Oxygenation was maintained using high FiO2, and CpCO2 was maintained by hyperventilation and pressure controlled ventilation. In the monitoring, ASA standard monitors were always there. An arterial line was inserted under general anesthesia. ABG was done at beginning of capnothorax and then at every 30 minutes till the continuous capnothorax was required. Ventilation was adjusted to maintain PaCO2 in the range of 35 to 45 millimeter of mercury. Coming to the positioning of the patient, in robotic thymectomies, the patient is positioned supine. The right side is elevated slightly with folded blankets or a gel pad, and the right arm is allowed to hang down and secured on an arm board to expose the axilla. The arm of the elevated side is positioned at the patient's side as far back as possible so that there is enough space for the robotic arms. This is the picture showing the positioning of the patient. Coming to the positioning concerns, in robotic thymectomy, there is a very increased risk of brachial plexus injury, and attention must always be given to the elevated arm or head to prevent the crushing injuries by the robotic arms. The analgesia was provided with paracetamol and diclofenac, and neuromuscular blockade reversal was done with neostigmine and glycopyrrolate once the top count was at least 2. The patient was extubated when he was fully awake, responding to verbal commands, and when top ratio was more than 0.9. The post-op monitoring was done in the post-operative care unit for about 1 to 2 hours, and then the patient was shifted to high dependency unit for overnight observation and monitoring. These are our demographic observations. Out of the 20 cases, 8 were male and 12 female patients with an average age of 35 years. The primary involvement in most of the patients was ocular, and it was followed by bulbar involvement. But most of our patients had ocular involvement mainly. We found satisfactory intubating conditions with atracurium despite the continuation of anticholinergics. The mean intubating dose was around 6.3 milligram of atracurium, while the mean total dose of atracurium required was about 8 milligram. So this is the bar diagram showing the total atracurium required in blue for intubation and the total atracurium required for the whole of the surgery in orange. So we can see that about 7 of our patients did not require any top-up doses of atracurium after the intubating dose. The mean time period between reversal from the muscle relaxant and the last administered dose of atracurium was about 70 minutes, and the mean time period of capnothorax was about 58 minutes. The muscle relaxation and the reversal at the end of the surgery was guided by neuromuscular monitoring. None of our patients showed any signs of residual muscle weakness on extubation and in the PSC. This is the bar diagram showing the preoperative pyridostigmine in blue and the time between the last atracurium and reversal in orange. 4 of our patients were on very high dose of pyridostigmine, but the dose of preoperative pyridostigmine did not in any ways correlate with the reversal time. So at the end of the presentation, the take-home message from these robotic thymectomies are: 1 lung ventilation using double lumen tube or bronchial blocker is not mandatory for robotic thymectomies. The capnothorax provides sufficient space in the thoracic cavity for surgical access. The specific concerns for robotic procedure include patient positioning, minimal patient access after docking, and the capnothorax resulting in high airway pressures. Appropriate anesthetic modifications can maximize the benefits of newer minimally invasive surgical procedures. These are my references. Thank you. So we will be taking the question answers at the end of the session, and I would like to invite Dr. Ashish Malik for the next presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Atish, and good evening, everyone. I will be presenting the second talk of the week today, and this is a topic which was done as a thesis topic by our DNB candidate, and the topic which I would like to introduce is the comparison of dural puncture epidural technique with combined spinal epidural technique for labor analgesia. It was a prospective randomized study, and the principal investigator being Dr. P. Sai Krishna, under my guidance, and the co-guides were Dr. Purnima Dhar and Dr. Lalita, both senior consultants in our department. So to start or walk you through this presentation, the introduction, I would just say that the labor pain causes maternal stress response as well as fetal distress. And how do we provide pain relief? It is through the central neuraxial techniques. And because of the continued research and a lot of validation, they have become the gold standard method. Now the focus is now only on the quality of analgesia. The commonly used techniques we all know is an epidural technique and a combined spinal epidural or the CSE. The drawbacks with the epidural technique, it's having a slow onset of action with an occasional variable blockade qualities. It could lead to an inadequate sacral spread and motor impairment. On the other hand, a CSC produces a rapid onset of analgesia with high patient satisfaction, but it could also produce maternal hemodynamic instability, nausea and vomiting, maternal pruritus, fetal bradycardia, amongst its side effects. So the focus of our attention moved towards the study matter, that is the dural puncture epidural technique. What we exactly do is the spinal needle is inserted through the epidural needle to puncture the dura. This needle is then withdrawn after a dry dural puncture and an epidural catheter is placed. The hole in the diameter acts as a conduit for a drug to migrate from epidural space into the intrathecal space. What benefit we achieve is there is an improved sacral blockade with a shorter onset of time. But since no drug is in the subarachnoid space, maternal hemodynamics, since we don't place the drug inside the subarachnoid space, maternal hemodynamics, nausea, vomiting, and pruritus being the side effects, as well as the fetal heart rate, are relatively less affected. What is the mechanism of this? It's complex. It's not still well known, but what can be postulated is the flux of local anesthetic and the opioid molecules between epidural and subarachnoid space occurs. And this depends on the ratio between diffusion across intact meninges and spread through the dural hole. Due to this complexity where we don't understand the exact mechanism, there are a lot of contradictory reports in the literature, and few studies are there comparing the dural puncture epidural with the CSC. Hence, we conducted this study to find out whether this modified CSC, called the DPE or the dural puncture epidural, is advantageous over the combined spinal epidural for labor analgesia, firstly in terms of onset of action, quality of analgesia, hemodynamic profile, and the side effect. So the aim of the study was to compare the effect of dural puncture epidural with the CSC for labor analgesia. The primary objective being to compare the onset of analgesia with the dural puncture epidural and the combined epidural in women with active labor pain. And second was to compare the quality of analgesia in both the study groups assessed by patient satisfaction score and the anesthesiologist doing the procedure. Secondary objective were outlined as four. We wanted to evaluate the incidence and severity of complications like maternal hypertension, nausea and vomiting, sedation, pruritus, and motor block in the study groups. Second was to evaluate the effect of both the techniques over fetal heart rate. Third was to assess the maternal delivery outcomes. And fourth was to compare the neonatal outcomes by assessing the APGAR score. We took 60 pregnant women with singleton vertex presentation of fetus with gestational age of 38 to 42 weeks of pregnancy, and those who were in active labor requesting labor analgesia. This study was done over 1 year in our hospital. And considering the minimum sample size at a 5% level of significance and 80% power, we took the minimum sample size to be at least 28 patients. And this was in reference to a study by Chow et al. Hence, we took 30 patients in both the groups in our study. The inclusion criteria included ASA 1 and 2 pregnant women with uncomplicated pregnancies and parents in active labor requesting labor analgesia. The exclusion criteria included the patient's refusal to take part in our study with a contraindication to Duraxil technique, women with diseases of pregnancy like gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, and gestational diabetes, or any conditions where there was an increased risk of cesarean section, or there could be a history of uterine rupture included in the exclusion criteria. The groups were divided randomly according to the random number table. The group D, which we will also refer to as DPE, that is dural puncture epidural group, and the group C, that was the combined spinal epidural group, where the patients were given CSC. To look at the methodology of the anesthesia technique followed, after a proper approval of the hospital ethics committee with a thorough pre-anesthetic checkup, a written informed consent was taken. The demographic data and the obstetric data were noted before the start of labor analgesia. All routine monitors were applied to the patient. Preloading was done with 10 ml per kg for finger lactate, with patient in sitting position, and the CSC kit used was 16 gauge 2D needle with 26 gauge spinal needle. The interspace used was L2 L3 or L3 L4 with a midline approach and loss of resistance to air. Just to tabulate what we exactly did, in the CSC, the dura was punctured with a 26 gauge spinal needle provided in the kit, 1.25 milligrams of 0.525% plain bupivacaine, with 20 mics of fentanyl were given in subarachnoid space after confirming CSF-free fluid. Then an 18-gauge epidural catheter was threaded 5 centimeters into the epidural space, and analgesia was considered adequate if the pain score was less than 3. On the DPE, what we did was the dura was punctured with 26-gauge spinal needle, CSF flow was confirmed, but no drug was given in the subarachnoid space. This needle was then removed, and the catheter was again threaded 5 centimeters into the epidural space. We gave a test dose of 3 ml of 2% lidocaine with adrenaline, which was followed by 5 ml of 0.125% bupivacaine, making a total initial bolus of 8 ml. And if we found that the pain score was more than 3 after 15 minutes, we bolused another 5 ml of 0.125% bupivacaine. Then both the study groups were started on background infusion after 15 minutes. The background infusion consisted of 0.1% bupivacaine plus 2 mics per ml fentanyl, which could range between a variable rate of 5 to 12 ml per hour, depending on the patient. Top-ups were again given as boluses if we detected some pain score more than 3, and a 5 ml of 0.1% bupivacaine with 2 mics per ml of fentanyl in both the study groups. So after standardizing the procedure, the parameters which we recorded was the visual analog score, the motor block, the heart rate, blood pressure, fetal heart rate, which were recorded before the start of the analgesic technique at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and every 15 minutes till 1 hour, and then 30 minutes till delivery. Duration of analgesia of the initial bolus was noted. The time taken subsequent top-up doses and number of top-ups were also noted. Side effects like nausea, vomiting, and pruritus were listed. Then mode of delivery was noted. Neonatal assessment with the use of help of Apgar score at 1 minute and 5 minutes were done. And the quality of analgesia was assessed by both the parturient and the anesthesiologist performing the procedure. So the statistical analysis was done by repeated ANOVA or the Fredman test, and depending on the distribution of the data, we could use the chi-square or the Fisher-Isaac test. P-value of less than 0.05 was taken as statistically significant, and the version of SPSS was 22, which was used. Now we focus our attention to what results and observations we had. The demographic characteristics were found to be comparable and statistically not significant in terms of age, height, and weight. The obstetric parameters like cervical dilatation and parity were also comparable and statistically not significant. In terms of the mean heart rate as well as the mean change in blood pressure in the parturients, again the p-value was found to be equal to 0.35, which was clinically not significant. Respiratory parameters in the CSE set, we had some episodes of desaturation, but the saturation did not go below 95%, and they were not clinically relevant, though it is depicted in this chart. Then the attention focus was pain score. In the CSE set, we understandably had a rapid onset of action, and the VAS score at that time was statistically significant as comparison to the group D, that is group D is the DPE. After the initial onset of action, the VAS scores remained same in both the groups. The motor blockade, again the p-value was more than 0.05, and it was not statistically significant in both the groups. Then the attention to the fetal heart rate, did it compromise the FHS? Then in the intra-group variation, there was a possibility of FHS happening, and it was much more incidental finding in the group C. But again, the p-value was more than 0.10, so it was not statistically significant. And looking at the analgesia, the onset of analgesia in group C, the CSE group was 223.33 seconds, and group D was 406.23 seconds. So understandably, the action was earlier in the CSE group. Then in the number of top-ups we used in group D and C were comparable, and there was not much statistical significance between the two. Even the last was the first top-up used. Now the number of top-ups were also comparable, and they were also not significant statistically. Then the attention is on the grading by the parturient, and though the para 3 gave a 93.3% thumbs up to the technique of DPE as compared to 80% of the CSE, but again it was not statistically significant, and both were quite happy with the quality of analgesia received. And the anesthesiologist grading for the technique was similar in both groups. If you look at the Apgar scores at 1 minute and 5 minutes, they were comparable with no adverse outcome. The maternal expulsion grading was also comparable with no p-value not being significant. And the side effect profile. So was there a benefit? understandably, in this bar graph, you can see that the nausea, the incidence was pretty high in CSC, vomiting also, pruritus becoming statistically significant. Maternal hypertension, there was cases, but they were not statistically significant. Fetal bradycardia, again, the incidence in the CSC group was 20%, and in case of the DP was 3.3%, but this was not found to be clinically relevant. So what can we discuss after this study, which we have just heard about now? There was a study by Raphael et al. That established the superiority of plain bupivacaine over hyperbaric solution. Hence, we used only plain bupivacaine for this study. Then, maternal request is a sufficient indication for pain relief in labor. And we should not wait till cervical dilatation has reached about 4 to 5 centimeters. This is the ASA as well as the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology mandate or recommendation. The mean cervical dilatation in group B was 3.5 plus or minus 0.68 centimeters, and that of group C, the cervical dilatation was more or less the same. The drug was directly given in the subcutaneous space in the CSC, and hence the onset of analgesia was faster. Whereas in the group DPE, the drug was given epidurally, which had to diffuse through the dural sleeve and the dural puncture for the effect second. The VAS score, understandably, the p-value again was found to be quite significant at 5 minutes and could be explained by the above observation. Except for the above point of time, there was no difference in the VAS score in both the groups. In both the groups, when we compared to the baseline, there was no significant difference. In the baseline, there was a significant difference in pain scores at any point of time, but not between both the groups. The quality of analgesia assessed by both the patient and anesthesiologist were found to be satisfactory. The labor outcome was similar. Fetal bradycardia, there, as I already described earlier, that the intragroup variation was there with a significant fall in the FHR after the administration of the analgesia. This could be due to the intrathecal opioids or the technique uterine contractions. The incidence was 3.3% in group D, and in group CSC it was about 20%. And these results are consistent with the various studies that have been done on the DPE technique. Maternal side effects, statistically significant nausea and pruritus. None of our patients had sedation, respiratory depression, or neurological complications, backache or urinary retention following labor anesthesia. And there was no incidence of post-dural puncture. So to summarize this presentation, the present study compared the DPE technique with the spinal CSC technique was carried out on 60 participants admitted in Indraprastha Apollo hospitals and randomized in 2 groups. The quality of analgesia was comparable in terms of number of top-ups required, pain scores, and the patient satisfaction score. There was no significant effect of both the techniques on the motor blockade. The maternal hemodynamics were clinically stable in both the groups. Both the groups were comparable in terms of duration after the initial dosage, duration of labor, and maternal expulsion bleeding. The fetal heart rate was almost stable in both the groups, although fetal bradycardia was seen more in the CSC technique. There was an increased incidence of pruritus and nausea with the CSC technique, which was statistically significant, and both the groups were comparable with respect to the mode of delivery. To conclude, we can say that the quality of analgesia is good with both the groups, though the onset of analgesia is slightly faster with the CSC group. The fetal and maternal outcomes are better with the DPE group. And with this study, we can recommend that DPE can be a better alternative to the CSC technique, but we still need further high volume studies to validate this conclusion. What we thought were the limitations of a study was the inclusion of this conventional epidural technique, if we had done, would have given us a more conclusive idea about anesthesia and labor outcomes. And instead of ABGAR score, if we had used blood gas analysis, it might have given us clarity about the effect of epidural analgesia on neonatal outcomes. These were the main references used in this study, and I thank you all for a patient listening, and thank you so much. Now I would like to invite the third presenter, Dr. Balaji, to present his talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. Today I'll be presenting on I'll be speaking on a study which was done at an institute on a comparison of chlorprocane and bupivacaine for spinal anesthesia for ambulatory surgery. Daycare surgeries or ambulatory surgery is a practice of admitting carefully selected and prepared patients for a planned procedure on the day of surgery and their discharge within 24 hours of the surgery. The benefits of ambulatory surgery include a short surgical wait list, faster discharge and faster recovery of the patient, and lower cost to the patient, the hospitals, as well as the third-party insurance payers. The recent advances in anesthesia in the form of improved technology, better anesthetic agents, better perioperative management, and acute pain management have made anesthesia very safe for ambulatory surgery. Regional anesthesia is highly effective for ambulatory surgeries as it provides a better post-operative pain control. It avoids the side effects of the systemic effects of the anesthetic agents. It reduces the use of opioids, and there is no airway manipulation. So all of which can help in faster recovery of the patient. An ideal local anesthetic for spinal anesthesia for ambulatory surgeries should allow for a rapid onset and offset of its effect so that the patient discharge can be done quick. So various local anesthetics that have been used in the past include lidocaine, pilocaine, bupivacaine, and chlorprocane. But all of them had some of the other issues or toxicities like transient neurological symptoms with lidocaine, urinary retention problems with prilocaine, longer duration of action with bupivacaine. So chlorprocane seems to be ideal for daycare settings as it is shorter acting. But in the past, various reports of neurotoxicities have been reported with the use of chlorprocane. But with more research, it was found that it was the pH of the solution and the sodium bisulfite, which was used as a preservative for the chlorprocane drug, which was responsible for the neurotoxicity. So later on, the pH of the solution was adjusted, and a new preservative-free solution of chlorprocane was approved by the FDA, which has been shown that it does not show any neurotoxicity. So we studied the feasibility of using chlorprocane for ambulatory surgeries and compared it with bupivacaine. A little bit about the drug. It belongs to the ester class of local anesthetics. pKa of chlorprocane is 8.7. It has the lowest protein binding among all the local anesthetics. It's metabolized by pseudocholinesterase, which is responsible for its shorter duration of action. The various preparations available are 1%, 2%, and 3%. The maximum dose which can be used for infiltration is 11 milligram per kg without epinephrine and 14 milligram per kg with epinephrine. Certain adverse effects include pain related to the procedural injection, adverse effects related to neuraxial anesthesia like hypotension, bradycardia, headache, nausea, vomiting, allergic reactions, especially because of the para-aminobenzoic acid, which is one of its metabolites, and local anesthetic systemic toxicity. Certain contraindications for the use of chlorprocane are allergy to local anesthetics, allergy to para-aminobenzoic acid. In liver diseases, caution should be maintained as pseudocholinesterase, which basically metabolizes the drug, is synthesized by the liver, and its production is decreased, which may prolong the action of chlorprocane. In preeclampsia as well, the activity of chlorprocane is pseudocholinesterase is reduced. So the chlorprocane duration might be prolonged. In neuromuscular diseases like myasthenia, the sensitivity to chlorprocane is increased, so it can lead to a prolonged action. So the aims and objectives of our study was, the aim was to compare chlorprocane and bupivacaine for spinal anesthesia for ambulatory surgery. The primary objective was to compare the time to reach eligibility criteria for discharge. The secondary objectives included to find the duration of the sensory and motor block, to find the duration of stay in the post-anesthesia care unit, to find time until ambulation, and time until self-voiding. Sample size and group divisions. At a 5% level of significance and 90% power of the study, we found that at least 21 patients in each group should be enrolled. So we took 25 patients in each group for our study. The patients were randomly divided into two groups, and the patients of group A received 40 milligrams of preservative-free formulation of 1% chlorprocane, and the patients in group B received 7.5 milligrams of 0.5% hyperbaric bupivacaine during spinal anesthesia. Inclusion criteria were age between 18 to 65, either sex, ambulatory surgeries of less than 60 minutes duration requiring anesthesia up to peak and dermatomal level, ASA class 1 and class 2 patients. Exclusion criteria were patients' refusal to take part in the study, infection at the site of injection, raised intracranial pressure, severe aortic or mitral regurgitation, certain neurological diseases, allergy to local anesthetics, and typical anticholinergics. Methodology. After obtaining the approval from the hospital ethics committee, a proper written informed consent was taken from the patient for the procedure, for anesthesia, and for the study pursuit. A thorough pre-anesthesia checkup was done a day prior to the procedure, and once the patient was shifted to the OT, routine ASA monitoring was attached. Final anesthesia was performed, and according to the randomization, patients were administered either 40 milligrams of chlorprocaine or 7.5 milligrams of bupivacaine. The sensory level of the block was assessed using loss of cold sensation to ice, and the motor block was assessed using Brumat scale. The assessment of the block was done every 1 minute. The time to readiness of surgery was defined as loss of cold sensation to ice at peak and dermatomal level. The peak block height was also noted, which was defined as 3 consecutive readings of loss of sensation at the same dermatomal level. During the procedure, the assessment of the block was abandoned, and at the end of the procedure, the patient was shifted to the PACU, and the level of the sensory and motor block was assessed again every 5 minutes and followed by every 10 minutes. In terms of analgesia, all the patients received IV diclofenac intraoperatively and IV paracetamol in the post-anesthesia care unit. The patients were discharged from the PACU after they met the following criteria: a minimum 60 minutes stay in the PACU, stable vital signs, signs of regression of motor block determined by a Brumat scale of 0 to 2, no analgesic requirement in the last 20 minutes, and normal consciousness. Once the patients were discharged from the PACU to the ward, the assessment of the block, both the sensory as well as the motor block, was continued in the ward as well. The patients were, once the patients were able to move with their legs as described by a Brumat scale of 0, and once there was a complete regression of the sensory block to S2 dermatomal levels, the patients were encouraged to ambulate. The patients were as well as encouraged to avoid as soon as they were in the ward. The patients were discharged from the hospital once there was a complete regression of the sensory block to S2 dermatome. There was a complete regression of the motor block defined as a Brumat scale of 0, ability to self-void, and stable vital signs. Rescue measures. Failed spinal was defined as inability to reach the deepened dermatomal level for spinal after this, even after 15 minutes of the spinal procedure, or if the patient complained of pain during the procedure. If there was a failed spinal, general anesthesia was given. For the post-operative pain, defined by a VAS score of more than 3, initially it was managed with IV tramadol, and if the pain was still persistent, then IV pethidine was given, and the hypotension was managed with ephedrine or phenylephrine, bradycardia with glycopyrrolate or atropine, and nausea and vomiting was managed with ondansetron. Statistical analysis. The statistical testing was done by using SPSS 17. Continuous variables were compared using student t-test, and categorical data was compared using chi-square test or Fisher's exact test. A p-value of less than 0.05 was taken to indicate a significant difference. We move on to the observations and results which we obtained during the study. In terms of the age distribution, we did not find any significant difference between the two groups, and the mean age of the patients in the chlorprocaine group was 46 minutes, and in the bupivacaine group it was 39 minutes. In terms of sex distribution, again the groups were comparable with a p-value of 1. There was no difference between the sex distribution in either of the groups. We observed that about 14 patients in the chlorprocaine group and 16 patients in the bupivacaine group belonged to the ASA class 2, and with a p-value of 0.5, the two groups were comparable in terms of the ASA physical status distribution. If we look at the type of surgery, 13 out of the 25 patients in the chlorprotein group and 14 out of the 25 patients in the bupivacaine group underwent general surgical procedures like hemorrhoidectomy, fistulectomy, etc. This was followed by urological procedures and then gynecological procedures. So we can see that the two groups were comparable and there was no statistically significant difference if we look at the type of surgery in both the groups. The time to readiness to surgery was defined as the loss of sensation at peak and dermatomal level. If you see in the chlorprotein group, this could be achieved in 7.5 minutes, and in the bupivacaine group, it was achieved in 7.1 minutes. So with a p-value of 0.1, the two groups were comparable, and there was no statistically significant difference. And we can see that the time to readiness was almost the same in either of the groups. We also assessed the peak block height, and we can see that 60% of the patients in both the groups were able to achieve a peak block height of T8 dermatomal level. So sufficient surgical anesthesia could be provided up to T8 dermatomal level in 60% of the patients in either group. So with a p-value of 0.3, both the groups were comparable in this aspect as well. In terms of the time required to reach the peak block height, the chlorprotein group patients required about 12 minutes 24 seconds, and the bupivacaine group people required 12.48 minutes. And with a p-value of 0.58, there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. In terms of the duration of surgery, it was also the same, almost the same in either of the groups, with 36 minutes being the mean duration in chlorprotein group and 35 minutes being the mean duration in the bupivacaine group. Duration of the motor block. Now here we found a significant difference between the two groups. The patients in the chlorprotein group had a motor block duration of about 68 minutes, whereas in the bupivacaine group, it required about 98 minutes for the block to regress. So if we see with the p-value of less than 0.001, there was a significant difference, and in the patients with chlorprotein group, they achieved a faster regression of the motor block as compared with the bupivacaine group. In terms of time to regression of the sensory block to S2 level, again we can see that in the patients with chlorprotein group, it took about 140 minutes for the block to regress to S2 level, and in the patients with bupivacaine group, it took about 226 minutes. So there was a significant difference between the two groups, and we could achieve a faster regression of sensory block in the chlorprotein group as compared with the bupivacaine group. Duration of the PACU stay, the patients could be discharged from the PACU in about 61 minutes in the chlorprotein group and in about 83 minutes in the bupivacaine group. So with a p-value of less than 0.001, there was a statistical difference, and we could shift the patient out of the PACU much faster in the chlorprotein group patients as compared with the bupivacaine group patients. So now we look at the intraoperative complications. As such, there were not many intraoperative complications which we could find in either of the groups. We could only see two patients in the chlorprotein group to have hypotension and one patient in the bupivacaine group to have hypotension. So both the groups were comparable in this aspect. Neither patients in either of the groups had bradycardia, nausea, vomiting, or headache intraoperative. So if you look at the time to ambulation, the mean duration for time to ambulation in the chlorprotein group was about 205 minutes, and it was about 253 minutes in the bupivacaine group. So there was a significant difference, and the patients in the chlorprotein group were able to ambulate much quicker as compared with the bupivacaine group. Time to self-voiding, again, we can see that the chlorprotein group patients, the time required or the time to first self-voiding was about 234 minutes, and in the bupivacaine group, it was 280 minutes. So again, there was a statistically significant difference with a much faster self-voiding in chlorprotein group as compared with the bupivacaine. Need for post-operative analgesia. Here we found a significant difference between the two groups, and if you look at the bupivacaine group, none of the patients required any rescue analgesia. But in the chlorprotein group, out of the 25 patients which we had enrolled, 5 patients required rescue analgesia in the form of either tramadol or pethidine or both. Now, when we look at the individual type of surgical procedures, out of the 5 patients who required rescue analgesia, 4 of them belong to the general surgical procedures, that is included hemorrhoidectomy and hysterectomies, and that is basically perianal procedure. Only 1 patient from the urological surgery required a rescue analgesia, and none of the patients in the gynecological surgeries required any rescue analgesia. So we can see that the general surgical procedures required rescue analgesia in much higher proportion as compared to the other procedures. So time to eligibility of discharge was again much quicker in the chlorprocaine group with 234 minutes as compared with the bupivacaine group of 280 minutes. So there was a statistically significant difference in the time to reaching eligibility for discharge. So moving on to the discussion part, from this study we could deduce that the chlorprocaine provided satisfactory surgical anesthesia for short surgical procedures requiring anesthesia up to T10 dermatomal levels. The onset of the block was comparable with bupivacaine. Both of the groups required about 7 minutes to reach the T10 dermatomal levels. Chlorprocaine as compared to bupivacaine provided a faster regression of the motor as well as the sensory blockade, faster discharge from the PACU, faster time to ambulation, and a quicker time to self-voiding, all of which led to a faster discharge of the patient from the hospital. When we look at the perioperative complications, we could not find any significant difference between either group, or we could not even find much complications in either group. Only a couple of patients had hypotension in the chlorprocaine group, and 1 patient had hypotension in the bupivacaine. In terms of post-operative analgesia, definitely there was a higher requirement of rescue analgesia in the chlorprocaine group. But if you looked at the type of surgery requiring rescue analgesia, most of these surgeries were of the perianal region. So this can be kept in mind when we use chlorprocaine, and we can use multimodal analgesia so as to reduce the requirement of rescue analgesia in the chlorprocaine patient. So there were some limitations in our study. First of it was randomization. Though we did randomize the patients in either of the groups, but there could have been some observer bias because the volume of the drug which we used was different in either of the groups. So the baricity of the drug was also different. We used an isobaric preparation of chlorprocaine and a hyperbaric preparation of bupivacaine. With a more comprehensive follow-up in the ward, we could probably have achieved the faster ambulation, as there was a huge disparity between the time till the patient had achieved the sensory regression of the sensory block and the motor block, and from the first time to ambulate. So with probably a more comprehensive follow-up, we could have achieved the faster ambulation in either of them. We could not do any post-hospital discharge follow-up, so any post-operative complications which could have occurred could not be found in this study. So further studies are required to eliminate these limitations. So the take-home message is chlorprocaine provides a safe and adequate spinal anesthesia for short ambulatory surgery. It has a faster recovery profile in terms of the sensory and motor blockade, has a shorter time to ambulation and time to self-voiding, all of which convert into a faster discharge and a shorter hospital stay. Thus, its usefulness as an ideal local anesthetic for spinal anesthesia for short ambulatory surgeries can further explore. So these are some of the references which will be used in our study. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Dr. Murli to take over for the next session.
Thank you, Bala. Now the session is open for questions.
Yeah, the first question is what was the incidence of failed spinal in the chlorprocaine and the bupivacaine group? So, so ma'am, we actually did not find any requirement of general anesthesia in either of the groups. Probably because the procedure duration in either of the groups was about 36 minutes. So, yeah, so that was the procedures were underwent smoothly, and there was no incidence of failed spinal in either of the groups.
Any other questions? If we don't have any other question, I'll request Dr. Vikram Mahajan to conduct the quiz.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Vikram Mahajan, Senior Consultant in Anesthesia at Apollo Hospital. And I'm going to be conducting the last part of this program, which is the quiz. I have a few questions that I have prepared. Now, the only problem being the virtual presentation, you're wondering how we are going to get the correct answer. So I believe when I put up the question, after the question is finished, you can all raise your hands and I'll pick up a person to answer the question. Okay, starting with my first question. Okay, the first question is on the global anesthesia workforce. Various countries have either physician anesthetists or nurse anesthetists or technicians providing anesthesia. India, of course, we have only anesthetists who provide anesthesia. And USA has both nurse anesthetists as well as anesthesiologists. My question is, what is the anesthesia providers in India? What is the number of anesthetists per 100,000 people? Anyone answering this question? Okay, somebody has raised the hand. Would they like to answer the question?
It's already answered in the chat box. One.
Okay, sorry, I haven't seen that.
It's already answered. It's one.
Well, quite close. Answer is quite close, but so how many anesthetists are there, practitioners that are in India?
One per 1 lakh.
So in total, yeah, you're quite close because it is roughly we have about. I can go to the next slide. I'll give you the exact. Yeah, so there are roughly, you said one, which is quite right. 1.9 is the exact. We have roughly 25,000 anesthesiologists that provide anesthesia to a 135 crore population. Okay. So roughly, yes, 1.9 per 100,000 population. In the US, there are 100,000 providers, out of which 50,000 are anesthesiologists and 50,000 are nurse anesthesiologists. Whereas in China, this is about 5.2 per 100,000, and total number there are about 71,000, and all of them are physician-based anesthesiologists. It's just for information. Okay, I'll go to the question number 2. So good answer, I think that was a correct answer. The second question is, what is the Lake Louise score and where is this used? Trouble is, people can look up at the internet and answer as well, which is acceptable. Somebody has raised the hand, and can we point at this also? Yeah, the person who has raised the hand can please answer the question if they like. Bala, you can see the internet and answer if you want. Headache. Okay, I mean, is part of the answer, but is actually, I'll go to the answer and explain it, because headache is included in one of the symptoms. So actually, this score is used for the diagnostic criteria as well as the severity of acute mountain sickness. Acute mountain sickness scoring on this Lake Louise score has got basically 4 symptoms assessment. Headache is an essential component. There has to be headache to diagnose acute mountain sickness, and there are 3 other symptoms. The GI symptoms include nausea, vomiting, weakness, fatigue, and lightheadedness. All are graded 0, 1, 2, 3, and a score of 3 or more is required to diagnose acute mountain sickness, out of which headache is a must. And then also the severity of acute mountain sickness is done by this score. Thank you. I go to the next question. This question is on the liver enzymes aminotransferases, the ALT and the AST, previously known as the SGPT and the SGOT. We all know that the rise in this is because of liver injury, hepatic injury, specifically for ALT, and AST has other causes as well because of the rise. Okay. The question is, generally in liver injuries, the rise of ALT is more than that of AST. So the ratio of AST to ALT will generally be less than 1. So in what conditions is the ratio of AST to ALT more than 1, and how in liver conditions? Which liver conditions? So Ranju Gandhi has said alcoholic, absolutely correct. Alcoholic condition. Any other condition? Well, all cirrhosis may not have, they may have low as well, but alcoholic liver disease certainly is one of the correct answers. Which is the other correct answer? Dr. Ranju Gandhi has given the correct answer. I'll go on to the answer again. So, as I said, most liver diseases have higher ALT than AST. That means the ratio is low. However, alcoholic liver disease and Wilson disease generally have a ratio of more than 1. Next question. This question is on the degradation of some of the halogenated agents with their carbon dioxide absorbers and in presence of dry heat, the production of carbon monoxide. Now, question is, which inhalational agents do not undergo degradation to carbon monoxide? Yeah, Dr. Nani has got this right. So, sevoflurane and halothane along with methoxyflurane, as they do not have a difluoromethyl group, which is responsible for the degradation into carbon monoxide. Good, Nani. The next question. Okay, so you need to identify this molecule and then give the principle of how it acts. No answers yet? Okay, I think I'll give the answer out. This molecule is Sugamadex. The molecule which can be used as to reverse the neuromuscular blocking drugs of the aminosteroidal group of drugs, specifically rocuronium and becuronium. And it does so by the encapsulating principle. One of the interesting things, points about Sugamadex is it can be given at any stage of the depth of the neuromuscular blockade, whether it is moderate level, whether it is deep, or whether it is intense. So if one has just given rocuronium and the surgery is finished and you need to wake up the patient and get the neuromuscular function back, you can reverse it with this molecule. Of course, the dose will vary. Okay, next question. Assessing cardiopulmonary function is a very important preoperative part of our assessment. And that is done by the functional capacity of checking the MET score, that is metabolic equivalent of a task that a person can do. And it, of course, varies from 1 to 12, with 12 being a very good MET score. And generally, 4 and more is considered to be giving you adequate cardiopulmonary fitness. The question is, what is the MET scoring for a person who can comfortably climb 1 flight of stairs? Four. They're close. Okay, 4 is close. Answer is 5. This is just a table put up from the Miller telling you the various METs on the left side, on the right side, what activity corresponds to that MET. So if you see point number 5, so MET of 5, climbing 1 flight of stairs, also means, I mean, if you can bicycle, that is also. And interestingly, playing golf is 6, playing singles tennis is 7, 12 would mean rapidly running moderate to long distances. I suppose Dr. Chitra would qualify in 12? More than 12. Okay. I go to the next question. I'll skip this one. We've got enough time, I'll go to the next question. One more, okay. So, this is a sonoanatomy of the neck structure. So this side is the medial and lateral. There's the carotid artery, the thymus. This is at the level of C6. Now, question is in 2 parts. First part is, what is the block being performed? And secondly, how would you identify on the sonoanatomy the level is C6 or C7 or C5? How would you distinguish that? Of this, the correct answer is stellate ganglion block. And the second part of the question, how would you identify the level? By looking at the transverse process, the anterior and posterior tubercles of the transverse process. C5 both are of the same size. C6 anterior tubercle is larger than the posterior, and C7 has an absent anterior or a rudimentary, as is explained in this and is shown in this diagram. Okay, so that concludes the quiz presentation. I would like to hand over to
Thank you,
Dr. Murli.
Vikram, for this very interesting and stimulating round of quiz. We had a great time listening to all the questions and answers. I would now request Dr. Ashish to give the customary word of thanks. Dr. Nikki?
Yes, Murli.
You can give your comments or whatever once Ashish is through.
No,
with
thank you.
time.
I just want to congratulate Polo Hospital and your team for a very wonderful clinical meet. Very, very interesting case series and challenging cases like your robotic thymectomy case series especially. That was very, very nice. And the quiz, of course, was the icing on the cake. So thank you so much for ending the year with the, with a bombastic clinical meet. Unfortunately, we haven't got many people attending. I think this 4 p.m. doesn't suit many because the attendance has been a little thin today. But we'll be, recording this and putting this up on the ISA website, and it will also be on the YouTube. So we'll be sending the link to you as soon as our team vendors they get their act in place, and I will send you the link so those who have not been able to attend because they are busy working, they can watch the presentations later. So thank you very much, Dr. Neja Murli, and all the
Yes,
speakers, and Dr. Mahajan. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Dr. Ashish is going to give a short word of thanks.
Yeah, okay.
So thank you, Dr. Nikki. And with this, we come to the conclusion of today's monthly clinical meet. On behalf of our whole Department of Anesthesia, I would like to express our gratitude to the ISA office bearers. Our many thanks to the faculty members and the attendees who took time out to attend this monthly meeting. I would also like to express my thanks to the IT department, especially Mr. Ravinder Singh for his technical help, the FNB, as well as Ms. Sangeeta Sood, who is our departmental secretary. And in the end, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Murli and Dr. Sanjeev for convening this session. And with this, I wish all of you the best in health and wish you a very happy new year and hope we come out of this and move into the next phase. Thank you so much.
We'd like Dr. Aneja to say a few words. Sanjeev. Sanjeev has been quiet.
Nikki is.
नहीं तो तेरे को थोड़ी छोड़ना है भाई.
It was lovely speaking to Nikki after many months, I suppose. And I hope next time I said that probably we will have a physical, no virtual meeting. And then you said probably the meeting would be around in October. Then I suggest probably that would be too late. We can have a mid meeting in April so that at least we meet all of us.
See, we had the last year's meet, this year's meet rather in October, remember? Yeah. So Gangaram had to have the virtual meet. So let's see what the national body decides.
Yes.
This is not for us to take a decision as of now, but it's very good to see you at the helm of affairs, Sanjeev. So, what's wonderful is most of the hospitals that we've had, the meetings with, so we have worked together at some stage or the other, and Sanjeev and I were together at RML, Murli and I were at Safdarjung, Lalita, my batchmate from Harding and Safdarjung, and so it's like, really feels like home. And it's lovely to interact at least virtually. So
we also have a significant number of years now working in anesthesia in the city.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. That's lovely, really nice. चलिए एक ललिता का आज गाना जरूर रखना चाहिए था आपको. उसके बगैर कैसे मीटिंग कर दी आपने?
ये बिल्कुल ठीक बात है.
Then the attendance should have been full.
Come on, chalo, we'll save it for another occasion.
Yes.
We'll save it for another occasion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you so much.
Nice
Okay, wish everybody a very, very, very happy new year. It has to be happy and healthy, but there is no other choice. And we all have to pray for that together.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Good evening. Have a good evening. Bye.